I want to present our presenters tonight. We're having a very exciting presentation tonight on beavers in California and in the world, and a little bit about their history. And we have two people that are experts at beavers. They are the co-directors of the Occidental Ecology and Water Center, and they seem to be at the center of all the beaver activities that are happening, I think, worldwide, personally, but definitely in California. And it is very exciting to have them here with us tonight. And I had the great honor of having them come up onto a project that I work on. And I'm just really excited to hear what they have to say tonight. So sit back and enjoy and learn about how important beavers are. All right. Thank you. I think Brock and Kate.
All righty. Well, thank you.
Did I say your names? Did I say your? Yeah, you can say your names.
All right. Well, Brock Dolman here. Yeah, with the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, our Water Institute. And
hi, everyone. I'm Kate Lundquist and really excited to be with you all. Thanks for taking time out of your evening and being willing to come on to Zoom. Thanks.
Yeah, we're excited to be here. And so the way the evening will work is that Kate and I are we're gonna do a PowerPoint show, and I'll do the first half, and then Kate will share her screen and she'll do the second half. And then our goal is to leave lots of time for questions and answers with all of you guys. So that's the thought. And so we'll get a little bit more into our backstory, but I just wanted first off just say thank you to Peregrine Audubon. For so many years ago with Trout Unlimited, you guys were instrumental on the what became the North Coast in-stream flow policy. Just something we're going to talk about, fish and flows and how beavers relate. So thank you for that. And yeah, and we're going to get going with this. And so I will go ahead and share my screen. And all righty, that look good? See some thumbs up out there? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for being here. We're happy to talk to a bunch of bird nerds, and that's a compliment. I know you guys are into this. And hi, Kate Marion Child. Nice to see you on the evening tonight. So, yeah, we're going to talk to you about this work we've been doing the last almost 12 plus years, 10, 11, 12 years now, really looking at beaver in California, and this idea of creating a culture of stewardship and reconnecting with just the relationship with this amazing organism and get into that. And so I don't know how many folks have been to where Kate and I work again for this nonprofit called Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. We're in Western Sonoma County, just up the hill from the bustling metropolis of Occidental. For those of you who've eaten your all-you-can-eat Italian dinners at Negri's or Ganella's, people know Occidental for that a lot. And we're on an 80-acre Farallon, check out. But specifically, the Water Institute is really this the program that that runs our Bring Back the Beaver campaign. And what's interesting for us was really that we got into the Water Institute really came about in many respects in thinking about salmon recovery, and specifically Coho salmon recovery, because the watershed we live in. So we're in the Russian River Basin, and we're in the Dutchbill Creek sub-watershed that flows to the lower Russian River where Monte Rio is. And it's historically an important Coho stream and still is today, although not many Coho return. And so we started working on Coho in the late 90s, early 2000s, and you can see that little chart down there at the bottom. Statewide in California, the decline of Coho was very precipitous and significant. And I think over the years, as we were figuring out how to recover Coho and looking at issues around limiting factors for Coho recovery and having to do with dams or issues with estuaries or non-native species or overfishing, and the myriad, the death of 1,000 cuts. At some point we started seeing papers about beavers and Coho salmon, and especially those papers were coming out of Washington State, Oregon State, coastal beavers, Coho, and we just got curious. We're like, well, we'll do anything to figure out the Coho recovery. And so we started talking about beavers, and we actually began corresponding with many of those scientists and bringing them to California. And that really commenced our process of beginning to work with beaver. So interestingly enough, beaver, there are 2 species of this big rodent called a beaver on the planet, and it's a northern hemisphere species. So if you're working on beaver around the world, you're only focused in the northern hemisphere, except for when introduced in the southern hemisphere, which is a problem, but we're not going to talk about that. So we have the North American beaver, which was all through Canada and through pretty much all the states of the lower 48 and even into parts of northern Mexico and Sonora at time of contact, and pretty much still is in those areas. It's Castor canadensis. There's also Castor fiber, which is the beaver that is throughout Europe and Asia, Mongolia, Russia, you know, that area. So we got 2 species. Kate's going to talk about some of the ecology work we did, but one of those efforts was really looking for California indigenous names for beaver. And so here's a few names that we put up on the slide for you all, trying to cover some of the tribes that are generally in your territories up there, of where maybe some of you live in parts of Mendocino County. We happen to be in the southern Pomo and the Coast Miwok territories down here in Occidental. Interesting thing about beaver is, again, we'll get into some of the biology here to start, but it's an incredibly very adaptable generalist species. And so they can be in high mountains, and obviously the whole claims them as their mountain. Upper right, there are beavers down in the Red Rock Canyons of the Southwest of New Mexico or Arizona or Utah. Or even down in the lower right, there is an image of our friend Rusty Cohen of beavers in a little creek in the city of Napa. So they're an amazingly adaptable critter, and yet they need a few things. And one thing to note is that they're vegetarian. So they don't eat other meat or life forms. They're all vegetarian. They're certainly well known for their ability to chew down trees. In the lower right, what you'll note is that aspen there is they cut the aspen down, but you can see they've taken away the bark, and it's the cambium layer on the bark with trees that primarily is where the nutrition is for a beaver. So they're both going to peel the bark back to get at the food, and then they're going to likely use those sticks for other things like dam building and lodge building and things like that. Or in the upper left is where they were coppicing a willow, and again they're eating the fresh bark around the willow. But you can also see that beaver in the upper right there having a little salad of grass, and they eat a lot of herbaceous plants. And so they're depending on the time of year. Actually, in the lower left, there's a bunch of little baby beavers that are eating a non-native plant called Ludwigia in a creek in Napa. So they love their salads, they love their bark. They're all around good vegetarians. They are mammals, of course, and thus they lactate. And you can see in that lower image, little baby beaver there with mama. Beaver are an interesting critter because I think many people, when you think rodent, you think like maybe how mice or rats breed, where they're making babies, and the babies aren't very old and they become reproductively capable, and their populations. Beavers aren't like that. Beavers basically have one set of babies, one set of the little babies they call kits every year. And they can have, 2 to 4 kits, maybe 6, depending on the quality of the habitat, the food. It varies a little bit, but not so many, a couple. And then interestingly, with the adults, there'll be mom and dad around. They'll have the kits of that year, but they'll have the yearlings from the year prior, and they might even still have some of the juveniles that would have been from 2 years prior. So they have these colonies, and they have multiple generations of beavers that are within a family group. And so they're really slow with regard to that, and they stay together, and they're very social. Beaver as a rodent, though, and like other rodents, with the image on the lower left, they do have the classic rodent teeth that are always growing and they're always elongating. And so the need to chew to keep shortening the teeth is something that beavers do. And beavers have these really cool teeth. We'll probably show some pictures later where they're actually the way the dentition works, they're softer on the back side of the tooth, on the front incisors there. The side facing the mouth is softer than the outside, and it has to do with food and iron and where they get that from willow bark. And so it acts like a chisel where it differentially sharpens and makes a point. And we could go on about the beaver teeth. They're really interesting critters there. And they're really good at using their teeth. They're quite articulate. They have an capacity to it's going to talk more about some of the just west of the Laguna de Santa Rosa, where Santa Rosa and Windsor and part of Rohnert Park, Cotati is. A couple years ago or a decade ago, beaver had been thought to be extirpated from the Russian River Basin, and then all of a sudden, in 2010 or 2011, in a park, a regional park east of Santa Rosa, beavers showed up in Spring Lake. And everybody started wondering what the heck is going on. And then by 2011, in the stream downstream of Spring Lake, Santa Rosa Creek, beavers were sighted. And then they were sighted further downstream. And then they were eventually sighted up on the Russian River. And actually, Kate and Kevin saw fresh chews as recently as just a few months ago up in that area on the Russian River. And so we don't really know where they're going next. But it turns out that on this image on the right-hand side where it says Spring Lake, if you were to keep heading east, you would go over the watershed divide and you're going to Sonoma Valley on your way area. And what it turns out is it looks beavers actually left Kenwood and where there are now, and they staged in the golf ponds in Oakmont in the golf community there because the beavers showed up there, and then they walked over the watershed divide of their own volition and reintroduced themselves to the Russian. So that's all just to say they're an incredibly adaptable critter, and they're bringing themselves back, and we just want to help them. They are an aquatic mammal though, and that's their gig, and that's what they're really famous for. And the interesting thing is that they're typically known for both the ability to build dams, meaning these structures built of wood and mud and stones and pebbles and gravel that ideally block a channel, a flowing channel, and impound that area and make a, quote, beaver pond. Depending on the pond and the lake, for instance, in that image in the upper right from the Sierras, if you can see into it and you look down at the perimeter of that green vegetation, there's actually the dome of a stick lodge, which is what's shown in that graphic in the lower right there. And so if you've got a lake, they'll have the classic beaver stick lodge where they can enter from under the water and go up into the lodge and hang out there with their family. But beavers also, in much of our coastal systems where we have more flashier rivers and not so many big lakes, will just burrow into the bank. And so that's what that picture on the lower left shows you, is what we call bank burrowing beaver. And they'll tunnel in below water level, and then they'll go up and they'll have their own lodge, but it's really in an earthen bank. And lodge building beavers, lake beavers, river beavers, bank burrowing beavers are all the same beaver. They're all Castor canadensis. It's just they're adaptable in their behavioral capacities. One of the key things though, and why they're entering lodges from underwater, why they're trying to impound water and make deeper water, is beaver are tasty to a whole bunch of critters. And we have mountain lions centered in the center image there. And in California, for the most part, mountain lion is, after humans, is definitely the top predator and carnivore of beaver in the state. Wolves, bears, and other states as well will certainly get after them. This is an image Kate took some time ago that's off of Carson Pass in the West Fork of the Carson River near the McCullummy Wilderness, if people know that area. So on the east side of the Sierras, Forestdale Creek, and just a classic high elevation east side Sierra mountain, that meadow complex, but then you can see those big beaver ponds and the linear shapes of the dams and all those open water areas that show up on this image off to the edge of the creek as all beaver created wetlands and habitats. And that's what we really love about beavers is you can see that really dry rocky slopes, those conifers, that classic high Sierra system. And then there's just this incredible emerald wet magnet of a wildlife habitat. Or you could take the beavers back down to Martinez, and right next to the station where the Amtrak train comes to Martinez, where the bridge is, in an urban flood control channel. And they have beavers where there's metal sheet pile holding up buildings and things. And so again, they're just amazing. And this organization called Worth a Dam, martinezbeavers.org, have a look at their website. They, when we were allowed to meet in person, they did beaver festivals for quite a while. And Kate's going to talk about something that we collaborated with Worth a Dam here recently on. So they're really fun. And the cool thing about beaver is in ecology, we have this metaphor, this idea, if you will, called this certain species that in the arch, a stone arch, there's a stone that would hold up the arch, the keystone. And when you take that stone out, the arch collapses. And so ecologically, beaver are a species like that, where their presence in the ecosystem disproportionately benefits the carrying capacity of the overall ecosystem for many other species beyond themselves. And so this image here, they're well known to be in the West, especially a keystone for Western pond turtle. We talked a little bit about Coho salmon, steelhead trout, Chinook salmon. That bird in the lower right there is a flycatcher, the willow flycatcher. And I'll talk about them a bit. There's a Cascades frog being held there from the Southern Cascades area that is absolutely, it's been documented that the presence of beaver begets conditions better for Cascades frog. And interestingly, folks out in the Sagebrush Sea, the Great Basin areas on the eastern side of the Sierras and Nevada and areas, the folks who are working on sage grouse have really gotten clear about the benefits of beaver in holding water on the landscape and creating those watery spaces. I mean, if you're going to try to digest Artemisia tridentata, imagine trying to eat sagebrush. You're going to need some water to go down the hatch. So sage grouse are really key there. And what's fascinating for us in California is if you look at that map in the upper left, what's called a rarity weighted richness index, which means that both the richness, the numbers of species in an area, and of those species, how many of them tend to not occur anywhere else but there. Obviously, California Bay Area is one of the great hotspots of all of the lower 48. And we think beavers have something to do with that. Just because we're with Peregrine Audubon and bird folks, we thought we'd show you a couple specifics. We were up at a place called Sage Hen, which is a research center north of Truckee, and worked with some folks looking at beavers, and with actually people from Point Blue and the Institute for Bird Populations as well. And we happened upon this, we were looking at this one beaver complex. And one of the cool things about beavers is when they flood an area, they're helping out with the mitigation of what in some cases are significant conifer intrusion into mountain meadows, into areas because of areas that have been dewatered, in many cases by the loss of beaver. And so there's a lot of interest in basically reducing conifer encroachment into these meadows, and lodgepole pine is one of the key species that does that. So here the beavers flooded it. Lodgepole pine doesn't like its feet wet. They died off in a big cluster. So we have a green forest setting where we have breeding blackback woodpeckers, which most people associate as a fire species, which it generally is, especially for its food source. But the idea that beaver could be creating critical nesting habitat for blackback woodpeckers by creating snags is something that we're still working on, the blackback woodpecker folks to recognize that. And then here's just some one slide from a paper by Campos et al. From 2019. That's Brent Campos from Point Blue and Helen Laughlin with the Institute for Bird Populations, doing a series of studies in mountain meadows and in these High Sierra and the Southern Cascades. And on the top there, you can see where they were looking at willow flycatcher specifically. And basically that curve there shows that the relationship of the number of beaver dams per hectare in a system, there was a direct correlation in the probability and occupancy of willow flycatcher. They're directly correlated. And it had a lot to do with willow flycatchers need that water to stay around on the surface throughout the time that they're nesting, which is really one way they keep predators away from the nest. And the way beavers manage willows and dense thickets of willows is really good for willow flycatcher nesting. And then they also looked at song sparrow. And if you look at that map kind of in lower right there, in the area where the beaver dams were absent versus where they were present, all those little polygons are song sparrow territories. And the density, i.e. the number of song sparrows this area could host and the density of them was directly correlated to the presence of beaver dams because of the amount of water versus not having beaver dams. So again, the carrying capacity for these two species and willow flycatcher being extremely endangered and very limited, this is something that a lot of us are interested in, bringing back beaver to help bring back willow flycatcher. They're interacting in the fluvial geomorphology and the relationship of rivers and how rivers move sediment and move geologic materials and move nutrients besides moving water, both downstream and in certain cases with life and wildlife going upstream, like in the coast for salmon. In this image here, we just wanted to note that this woman, Sarah Muskoff, was doing her thesis in looking at Taylor Creek, which is in South Lake Tahoe there, and basically found that the presence of the series of beaver dams functionally increased significantly, statistically, the removal of phosphorus that didn't thus enter Lake Tahoe. And so the whole idea of keeping Tahoe blue, we really think that beavers are helping keep Tahoe blue because it's those sediments, whether it's soil or phosphorus or nitrates, nitrogen, that are decreasing the water clarity of Tahoe. And so the having beavers in the wetland areas can also support that. And then there's a whole piece of this puzzle that's been recently noted and increasingly noted around just beginning to think about the presence of beavers and the beaver dams and the associated beaver wetlands that are created behind those dams, the collective, the whole aggregate of the beaver habitat that's wetted and green and moist. And so this image by Dr. Joe Wheaton of this fire in Idaho, where you can see that the entire watershed around that area burned off, but that little wetted emerald necklace there that stayed moist reduced the fire or didn't burn at all. And in fact, they had some photos from the Forest Service where they were flying over this area and they looked down and they could see a black bear who had been hunkering down, who fled the fire and hunkered down and saved itself by being associated with this wet beaver habitat. So this idea of Smokey the beaver is a friend of Smokey the bear and a connection. And then we're also really talking about the beavers are holding back water and recharging the water. So this idea of resiliency, of buffering the climate extremes, of when there's too much water for floods, they can slow it down and spread it out. And when there's not enough, they've slowed it and spread it and sank it into the land. And then they're reducing fire extremities. So they're really not only keystone species, but they work with what we call keystone processes of hydrology and fire and landscape level resiliency. And so really a key thing for all of us who are now going into what will be noted as one of the great droughts, at least up till now this season, we're really interested, do we live in a water scarce area or a storage scarce area? And in this case, it didn't rain much. So any bit of water we got, it would have been really nice to keep it on the land. And that's what beavers do. They slow the water, they spread the water, they sink it, they store it, and they share it. And so around groundwater recharge and delaying the release of water and supporting in-stream flows, again, for things like fish and salmonids and frogs and humans. And there's a whole lot of folks in the arid Intermountain West and a number of ranchers we'll mention here who are really clear. Beavers don't make water, they just help keep it around. And so this is a wonderful series of images that a woman named Carol Evans, who was working for the Bureau of Land Management in the Elko district. So again, we're over into Nevada, average of say 6 inches of rain a year, high desert, 4,000 or 5,000 feet in elevation, sagebrush, pinyon juniper, and this creek here, Susie Creek. So this is an image of Susie Creek in 1992. You can see it's deeply incised, it's eroded, it's down cut, it's been being grazed in the hot season, it's completely denuded. And then they basically changed the grazing regime first to remove the cattle pressure in the riparian zone in the hot season to give the vegetation a chance to grow back. And that allowed the beavers to return. And so then by 2012, in this image here, the beavers had come back. They were building dams. They actually were raising the water table. They were regrading the incised stream. It was perennial, wetted perennial. The fish had returned. Their frogs were returning. Many species of waterfowl were now using it for nesting. And it was just a change in grazing regime in this case, and stop killing the beavers and allow them to return. And so there are case studies of this happening all over Nevada and Utah and Idaho and Wyoming and Colorado and Eastern Washington, Oregon, and we want more in California, to be honest with you. So our mantra is that you fight incision with incisors, and we want to upgrade systems instead of degrade systems. And we're beaver believers and sticking with it. You know what I'm saying? We're damn tootin'. One of the things about beavers is that there's a lot of questions back here in the coastal salmon country around, well, don't beavers block salmonids? Don't the dams block the fish passage of the adults going upstream or the juveniles going downstream? And there's been a lot of studies, and we reference some here on the right, of really looking at how beaver dams function in the landscape. And the Haida people of the Pacific Northwest have a great saying that says, beaver taught salmon how to jump. And beaver and salmon have been with each other for a long time, 5 million years at minimum in this area. And the humans, if we want to talk about who's blocking fish passage and why the salmon are on nearly extinct, I think we should stop blaming beavers and really actually look in the mirror at our collective selves in the recent 100+ years. But these beaver dams are incredibly complex. And the interesting thing is that dams aren't necessarily the whole story with beavers. While we love the way beaver dams, this is some work that was done by Marissa Parrish and Justin Garwood from the, up in the Smith River system. So where the river's big enough and the flow is enough and the can't put a channel spanning dam across the river. So they're bank burrowing beavers, but underneath the water, you can see they make a mess. What these folks here have called a river reef. So their bank lodge creates a river reef. And what they observed is all these species of vertebrates and invertebrates were using these river reefs as critical habitat, even though there was no beaver dam there. And so all of that to us adds up to a sense that really honoring beaver is a species that we ought to really acknowledge and recognize in California and really bring back. And so we've been working a lot with what we would call a collaborative conservation idea, from the ridgeline to the reef. And we've been working with lots of people and partnerships, and you'll see lots of logos there. And what's been fun is once people really get the sense of the importance of beaver and the value beaver could bring to their work, then a lot of folks get on board with that. And so thus we get to our Bring Back the Beaver campaign, and I'm gonna turn it over to Kate and let her take it away from here. So thank you all for listening there. And yeah.
All right, thank you, Brock. Fantastic. I am going to get into my presenter view here and keep telling the story. Wow. So yeah, lots to say. And as Brock already mentioned, we've been at this for a while. We, in doing all of this work and looking at how we can recover salmon more quickly and seeing how there was all this amazing work happening in other states, we started checking in with folks in California and realized, wow, there's a lot of folks doing restoration in California who aren't aware of beaver and their role that they could play and aren't actively incorporating them into their restoration efforts. And so it was so much so that we realized we need to actually launch a campaign to really educate our colleagues, our communities, our agencies, and individual landowners in particular who were either fighting beaver or just not recognizing their value and taking full advantage of an active partnership. So we've been doing tons of outreach and education, talks like these, and also, you know, doing field visits with folks, getting out there on the landscape and showing folks, you know, like we did with the Marin RCD of like, wow, what's happening with the beaver out here? And are there things that we could be doing more to further enhance their beneficial impacts? And really getting folks involved with the citizen science as well and engaged. We have a lot to do in California around tracking our beaver. And so there's a lot of help that we can receive from folks that are interested in helping with that effort. And also, given that there's all of this amazing research happening outside of California, we really need to start focusing some research efforts in California specifically and demonstrating the benefits so that we can further evolve our understanding of the role beaver can play in California and ultimately change the rules so that we can make beaver stewardship and restoration easier for those who are trying to do that. So a little bit about the history of beaver. Brock mentioned a little bit already. Beaver are native to California. They always have been. You know, we don't have an estimate of how many beaver in California used to exist specifically. However, the estimates for North America in general are around 400 million across North American continent. 10% of the landmass was covered with beaver managed wetlands. That's a lot. Imagine trying to get across the North American continent and, you know, folks ran into beaver wetlands all the time and it made it really hard to get across. So it turns out beaver were one of the first resource extraction efforts that happened on the North American continent because of their fur value. That fur makes amazing felt. And so most hats of that era were made with beaver pelts. And also their castor glands up here in the upper right, those were used to make medicine and perfumes as well. So big business. And this is where our first corporate charter with the Hudson's Bay Company was formed in the 1600s. And there's a huge long arc of basically European and Asian extraction of beaver, first on the European continent and then on the North American continent. And this funded colonialism. So fast forward to California. Let me get my advanced thing going here. Sorry, there we go. By the time California had become a state, we had nearly killed all of our beaver. Some estimates say that we had 1,000 left in the state. And thankfully, our Division of Fish and Game, as it was called back then, recognized the value of beaver and saw what benefit they could bring to our wildlife, particularly up in the mountains, you know, for fish and other species. And so there was a big relocation campaign that went from the 1920s until 1950. And if you look at this map here on the left, you can see all of these little dots are places where beaver were returned to their native habitat. And California moved upwards of 1,200 beaver. And it wasn't just California. This was a big movement across the West that was happening. These images that you see on the left are from Idaho. And then this poster was made by our Division of Fish and Game, and beaver were in fact thrown out of airplanes with parachutes. And if you haven't seen the footage, I highly recommend you look it up online. There's great black and white footage of beaver being relocated with airplanes. Kind of amazing. So then in 1942, Donald Tappy was charged with coming up with this very exhaustive status of beaver report in California. And he came on the heels of the mammologist Grinnell, who had already determined that beaver were only native to the Central Valley, the northern part of the state, and over here in Colorado, the Colorado River. And this was based on research that had been done in the 20s and the 30s after there were hardly any beaver left. They interviewed trappers. And as it turns out, beaver had been being trapped since the 1700s in California, way before the mountain men came over across the continent and over the Sierra. And so by the time these interviews were happening, who knows where the beaver were and who knows what the stories were that they were encountering. But it was such that they ended up developing this perception that they were only native in these very few areas and that they did not occur anywhere in the Sierra above 1,000 feet, and certainly not on the coast because it was too rocky and there just wasn't enough food. And those of us who know beaver and have seen beaver on the coast and Sierra, we're kind of scratching our heads. It just really makes sense. And the reason this is important is it was affecting the way beaver are being managed. And still to this day, our Department of Fish and Wildlife refers to this document and still believe that beaver are not native to the Sierra and possibly not the coast as well. And this affects how they're managed. It means that they're treated like non-natives and they're more easily killed and certainly not valued in that sense. So a bunch of us got together and started gathering evidence, and thankfully a gentleman by the name of Chuck James, he had the sense to recognize what he was seeing in the 80s when he was doing some work up in Red Clover Valley, which is in Plumas County. And there was a flood event that unearthed some sticks. And when he looked at it, he knew what it was. He saw it as a beaver dam that had been unearthed. And so he got it carbon dated. And sure enough, several different layers, he pulled sticks and sent them in for radiocarbon dated data analysis. And they came back with really old dates, 540 AD, 720, and then 1850. And so that was really good proof positive that beaver were in fact up at high elevation, in this case in Plumas County, before contact, before the Europeans came over. And after that, a bunch of other evidence was found as well. Lots of historic accounts, lots of indigenous stories, place names, lots of other physical evidence, buried bones and teeth and whatnot. And so we ended up putting together this map, which you can see the red line that goes around. And so this is the proposed historic range of beaver for California, which includes the entire coastline, as you can see. And for the North Coast, where we are all in, presumably, we found lots of evidence as well. To note, in one archaeological dig, there was a tooth found over here in Randall Creek, just below the Mattole River, and lots of other types of evidence. And here is a list of some of the names. We found 60 names for beaver in native California languages. And so clearly, beaver played a huge role pre-contact in native California, and that is something that we take really seriously. And we are always looking for new evidence, and have actually found, we got a sample carbon dated from, again, up in Plumas County that was 1,270 years before present, which is just adding to the list of evidence. And so, for those of you who talk to old timers and whatnot, if you ever come across stories of beaver, particularly pre-relocation era, so that would be pre-1923, we want to know about that because we need to continue to retell this story. So currently our policy regarding beaver in California, it's pretty sparse. Thankfully, in 2019, there was a Assembly bill passed, AB 273, the Wildlife Protection Act, which ended up banning the recreational trapping of fur bearers, which includes beaver. So prior to that, beaver hunting, trapping for recreation was legal in 42 of our 58 counties, and now that is no longer legal. So that can help make sure that our beaver population thrives. In the meantime, we've really been working with the department to try to get more information out about how to coexist with beaver, and I'll talk more about that. There is a part on the website now that has this information, and so that was a big win for us to get the department to actually include that, because beaver were not represented in that way. And however, we still allow beaver depredation, which that means any landowner or tenant who is suffering damage by beaver can apply for a permit to kill that beaver. And oftentimes this has to do with vegetation that's getting harmed, flooding. There's a bunch of different things that beaver can do. However, we have all kinds of solutions. And so this is right now our biggest issue of how we're losing beaver, in particular because there's no limit to how many beaver property owners can depredate. And right now they're not tracking whether or not listed species are being impacted. So Brock was talking about the willow flycatcher and Coho salmon. And so we're working on an effort right now with the Center for Biological Diversity and the Environmental Protection Information Center to try to change the language about depredation permits, both to make it a requirement that non-lethal strategies be exhausted before a permit is granted, and then also to really have a system in place that makes sure that our endangered species aren't going to be negatively impacted if in fact those beaver are killed. And we cannot possess or move beaver in our state, and that is a relic of our Department of Agriculture deeming beaver, like all rodents, a detrimental species, and I'll talk more about that. So poor beaver, they're damned if you do and damned if you don't. We really feel for them. They're doing their best, try to help preserve really great habitat, and we're doing our best to help them do that job. So there is an amazing movement of folks across the continent, but in particular, the Intermountain and Arid West, who are working on beaver and process-based restoration. And there's a lot of science to back it up. And these two manuals are kind of our go-to guidebooks that really lay it out in really clear and very well-supported language of how we need to be thinking about our riverscapes and what role beaver can play in the restoration of those riverscapes, and how we can be working with beaver to harness all of the processes that they enact, because they are a disturbance regime in and of themselves. And we certainly have a lot to gain from the hard work that they put in round the clock, no permits, they just go for it. And it's kind of amazing to be able to harness that energy. They do it a lot better than we do, and for free. So what about coexistence? How do we do it? We have a lot of great strategies, and these have been really well demonstrated across the East for decades now, and we're implementing them more and more in the West, and with great success. Very inexpensive and easy to do. Culverts, for example, beavers love to plug. For them, it's just a hole in the dam, i.e. the roadbed, that is easy for them to fill, and then they can create that pond and aquatic escape cover like Brock was talking about that is so valuable towards their survival. However, if you just put in a simple fence with some T-posts, they give up because the water flows over, and blocking this up doesn't really have the impact that they're used to having when they just actually block the culvert. Even better, put a pipe in and put a cage at the end of the pipe. They can't hear or feel the flow, and they give up even sooner. They just, it totally confuses them. And these cost under $2,000 to put in, if not, less, and you can do it in a day, and you barely have to maintain them. Once a year, check them out, make sure they're not misbehaving, and it's a done deal. Like I said, they love vegetation, and California has a lot at stake with our vegetation. We are a very important agricultural state, and we certainly don't want our almond trees and all of our other crop species being impacted, nor do we want ornamentals and whatnot. And when you look at the reasons why beaver are depredated, turns out that vegetation damage is one of the highest reasons. And so we have many methods. You can wrap them, you can put electric wire around a group, or if you're in a place where you need to maintain aesthetics, like on the interpretive trail here in Taylor Creek, the Forest Service worked with the Sierra Wildlife Coalition to put sand paint on the trees. And so this is basically an exterior latex paint that has been color matched to the bark, and then some masonry sand has been put in, and then the artistic types got in and did some painting. And the one here with the fluoro tape is the one that's painted. So you can barely tell the difference. And yes, it does have to be maintained annually and checked in on, but it's a great place. It's a great technique if you're in a place where you have some key trees that you want to keep beautiful and not have fencing around. Flooding is another concern. And once again, we have solutions for flooding. Basically, if you put in what is called a flexible pond leveler, you put a pipe through the dam, you create a notch in the dam, and then you set the pipe at the height you want the pond to be. You need to keep it high enough to keep the beaver around. The goal here is to keep the beaver so that you receive all the benefits and the habitat, but you stop them from getting it higher, because they often will want to go higher and higher, as high as they can get away with. But in this case, you can stop it and they give up, because as much as they build, the water level doesn't get higher, because this has basically become a spillway now. And then again, you put this cage at the pipe here at the inlet, because they're induced to build by sound. Running water is what makes them want to come and like fill and block and all of that. And if they can't get close enough to hear it or feel it, then they give up. And we've had a lot of great opportunities to work with different departments of transportation, like Caltrans, Community Service District, and El Dorado Hills. We're working right now on a project with Sonoma Water Agency here in Sonoma County to put these devices in, and it's a win-win. It's super low budget and low tech, but high effect and high benefit. And once you get these in, you get all the neighbors out and you get everyone to come and see how they work. And they're like, wow, this is great. This actually works. I was a little suspicious, or I didn't think, we could actually keep the beaver around. And so this right here in El Dorado Hills, you see all kinds of wildlife showing up. And this is in the middle of this crazy subdivision. And it's kind of the only aquatic habitat they have going for them, particularly in the dry summer, since this is foothill oak woodland savanna. So it's a great technique, and more people should be doing this in California. And Brock and I are really excited. We're working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Sutter National Wildlife Refuge, where they get lots of birds coming in, and they're managing those wetlands for those birds. But meanwhile, beaver are taking advantage because they love aquatic escape cover as well. So they hop out of the Sacramento River and come into these nice still ponds where there's lots to eat. And they sense the water going through these risers that are conveying the water from one wetland to the next, and they block them up because they think it's going to help make the dam get bigger and make the water deeper. So this is causing a lot of problems for the managers. They've had to, basically pay for a lot of workers' comp cases because folks' backs are getting injured because they're having to get in there and dig these out every week. And it's been a real problem. And last year, they came up with this device that they welded together, and they slid it into the riser and put a pipe, and then it goes further out. And there's some welded wire out there to prevent the beaver from blocking it. They can still control the water height with their internal flashboards here. And with this lid, they can open it up and check out what's happening and adjust the water level. And since they've put this in, they've only had to check it once a year. Huge difference. And so we're about to do a pilot with them where we're going to install more there. We're also going to work with a rice grower to install one, and also a duck club. And once these are in, we're making some educational materials, and we're really interested in getting the word out to all of those constituencies and across the West, because a lot of folks who manage wetlands are actually killing beaver right now, which is totally unnecessary. So help us get that word out. We'd appreciate that. So we do a lot of restoration planning and implementation with a particular focus in salmon streams and riparian rangelands and mountain meadows. those are areas in California where there's a lot of restoration happening already. And there are beaver that could really help with those restoration efforts. And so we've worked on a lot of projects already to date, as you can see on this crowded map on the left here. And we often do, in addition to demonstrations, we do exhaustive planning processes where we come up with reports where we identify all of the historic evidence of where beaver have been, the current evidence of where beaver are, and where they might come from, if we can encourage them to come over to where we're trying to do the restoration, and really just try to accelerate the beaver restoration process in these places. And we're really grateful to be working with folks who aren't often associated or aren't actively involved in the beaver restoration movement. We've been bringing more ranchers on board in California, and we're getting to work with a lot more tribes, which has been fantastic, such as the Mighty Summit Consortium up in Tasman-Coyom. This is the site visit that we got to do with the Marin County RCD. Thank you all for inviting us out and really getting to get out there at the Willits bypass property and see what the beaver are doing, and see just what potential there is for harnessing their efforts to really help increase and improve that wetland, which is already really fantastic. And it was great to see the existing dams and just to brainstorm around, are there things that could be done to further accentuate and accelerate the process that the beaver are already engaged in. A lot of folks across California are now picking this up and working on active beaver restoration. These are some of the earlier adopters, in particular, the Scott River Watershed Council up in Siskiyou County. They helped forge the path and really figure out how to accelerate beaver restoration by putting in beaver dam analogs and other forms of beaver mimicry to really accelerate the process in places where beaver dams are more likely to get blown out by high flows. Yurok tribe is doing a bunch in the Klamath Basin, and Childs Meadow is up near Mount Lassen. This is a place where a study was associated with the restoration project as well. And Brock was showing some of the bird findings there with the willow flycatcher and the song sparrow. But they're also looking at carbon sequestration and just water retention and all of that. And so we're really excited to be part of these efforts to really try to help get this information out. And then this is one of the beaver dam analogs that went in up in Tasman-Coyom this last fall, and there will be more going in. This is on Yellow Creek. This is an area where beaver used to be, and we're trying to get them to come back. Here's a place down near Lincoln, California in the foothills called Doty Ravine. And this is one of our best case studies in California, because as you can see in this photo up here, this used to be a really dry foothill oak woodland with this single threaded channel that really was only wet in this narrow band. There's a bunch of cattle grazing happening here. There were levees that were keeping the water from getting out onto the floodplain. There used to be a little off-channel wetland here that was kind of drying up, and they were killing the beaver because they had inherited this management technique. And they were trying to get some funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to restore this area. And they said, sure, we'll help you. But first off, we need a beaver peace treaty. We need to stop killing your wetland manager, which are the beaver. And so they agreed, and they went the other direction and started reinforcing existing beaver dams. So this is a dam that was already there that they just put posts in to make sure that it didn't blow out during high flows. And then they started putting in these beaver dam analogs, mimicking the beavers in other key strategic places, hoping the beaver would adopt them. And sure enough, just within a 2-year period, this original narrow channel expanded all the way over here to this edge of the floodplain. And then they dug out some of the levee, and now in 2021, all of this area on the left here is flooded as well. And this is chest high, deep beaver managed water all the way across. They have dams that are 500 feet plus, and it's so thick in there you can barely move around. It's like Brock calls it a class 5 beaver wetland. This is like amazing, amazing, amazing case study. If you ever get a chance to get out there, this is Placer Land Trust land, and there's incredible birds out there. They have wildlife cameras, and they're catching all kinds of nesting birds and owls in the day hanging out on the dams. It's a party out there for sure. So what about relocation in California? What's up with that? This always comes up, this question, especially since many states in the West actively relocate beaver to help repopulate areas where beaver used to be. And it turns out that in California, we're still not able to do that. And our department has been really reluctant. We have met with the department, we have asked why, and it comes down to liability, concerns around fisheries health, concerns around disease transmission, and other things. And so this is something we're working on with the department, because as it turns out, a lot of these concerns have been solved in other states. Washington State, for example, they forced their Fish and Wildlife Department to adopt beaver relocation through a legislative bill, and came up with a relocation pilot where basically, to address the liability question, landowners have to sign off on the liability. If any damage happens, the department will not be held liable for that. And you can quarantine beaver for diseases and treat them and make sure that you aren't moving diseases around. And, you know, as Brock already mentioned, beaver are really good for, you know, particular fisheries. And if there are questions about other fisheries, well, then let's do a pilot and figure that out. We have lots of eager researchers. Thankfully, we have some amazing professors now out of Chico State and Cal State Channel Islands, Emily Fairfax, and UC Davis, who are helping steward researchers, students who really want to answer these questions. And so we have the answers at our fingertips, and we're working to see if we can make these a reality. Certainly, relocation is not the be all end all. It's a tool we'd like to have in the toolbox after we exhaust all the other tools, because there are limitations. You know, beaver don't always survive relocation and whatnot. However, we would like to have it as a possibility. Otherwise, those poor beaver might end up with the doctor, and, you know, hopefully they actually have some aspen to give out to beaver, because that is their favorite food, as it turns out. So where are beaver in California? We met with Director Chuck Bonham from the department, and he asked us, how many beaver do we have in California? Where are they? Well, nobody is tracking this. No one has the budget to track this. Certainly our Department of Fish and Wildlife doesn't. And so we've been asking folks to help us map beaver distribution. For those of you who are familiar with iNaturalist, certainly I hope with you bird nerds, you might have already been using. I know there are other eBird and other apps for birds, but if you are out there and you have a smartphone of some sort or a camera, please help us continue to record observations. Fresh chews, old chews, beavers themselves, if you're so lucky, and post them. And you can see here what our current map shows for Mendocino County area. These are the beaver down here on the lower Russian that Brock was already talking about. We'd like to see more points up here in Mendocino County if in fact they are there. So help us out. And we ran a beaver blitz actually for Sonoma County and organized a bunch of volunteers to just go out and walk our waterways with cameras. And it was really successful. We got a lot more observations that we hadn't had already. And if you don't know what you're looking for, in our beaver booklet, we have great pictures of all the different signs, whether it's dams or bank lodges, bank lodge on a lake, little combo, bank burrows with channels. Sometimes they'll be exposed because the water levels come down and you can see the entrance to burrows. Canals, beaver are big canal diggers and maintainers. Slides is another great way. If you are so fortunate to be out tracking in the snow, that can be a really easy way to find beaver. Tracks in general are another great way. Felled trees, obviously, that's kind of a no-brainer, especially if they're big trees. Sometimes you'll see little chews from muskrats or porcupines are certainly going to remove bark, but these big pencil sharpened shape, that's beaver. And people will also often send us photos of sign of like, hey, what's this? I saw some chopped wood alongside the creek, and if it's got a straight edge and you can't see the grooves of the teeth, it's likely it's a two-legged beaver hominid who is doing some machete or lopping work on the creek side. And scent mounds. It's once you smell a beaver scent mound, you will know what I'm talking about. That's how they communicate. That's how they establish territory. That's how they recognize one another. And that can lead you to sign if you're so lucky to find one. And scat is another way too, which can also be really hard to find because it's generally underwater. But if you're in a really still water area and you see this pile of sawdust, that could be beaver scat. So our goal is to help folks become aware and take care of our current beaver populations. And we have this beaver booklet, which is available as a downloadable PDF if you want to read it online. If you want a physical copy, Joe Scriven of the RCD has got some in his possession at the Ukiah office, as far as I understand, and we'll post his phone number if you want to go get one. You can call him and see when he's going to be there and come pick one up yourself. And if you're not in the Ukiah area and you just want to get one sent to you, you can reach out to us at OAEC and we can make sure that happens. And if you aren't familiar with this fantastic book by our colleague Ben Goldfarb, Eager, this book, it's the tell-all, it's the whole story, and it's not just North America, it's the Eurasian beaver and everything. And there is a chapter on California, so you can learn a lot more about that. And it's great because it's also an audiobook if some of you prefer audiobooks. Highly recommend checking that out. And some of you I know were on the California Beaver Summit that we just had, the first ever, super fantastic. We had a great turnout of speakers from mostly California, but some heavy hitters from the West as well. And we had 1,000 people sign up. It was amazing. And I think 112 of those were from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So really grateful that we had such a great turnout. And every single session and talk was recorded. And so if you go to this website below, you can even look at individual talks. So you don't even have to scroll through the whole video to get at the topics that you're interested in. So definitely check that out and stay tuned. I imagine we will do another one. And this was the idea of the Martinez Beaver folks, Heidi Perryman, and we had a great steering committee of folks from all around California putting this together. And for those of you, if you're really interested in beaver, especially in how they intersect with birds, it's a great idea to just adopt a colony and start tracking them and taking photos. And like these folks in San Luis Obispo, they started a whole beaver brigade. And now they have a website, and they have tours, and they do garbage cleanups, and they really track all the beaver that they have out there and are working with their local decision makers and whatnot. And we need more folks like that. You know, we have river keepers, we need beaver keepers on the landscape to really help keep tabs on what's happening with our beaver and help us understand what impacts they're having, both beneficial and detrimental, so that we can step in and employ some of these coexistence techniques that we've been talking about. So really grateful to the RCD, who is putting out all kinds of great videos and information, and you all have been doing a fantastic job helping your constituencies understand what's happening with your beaver, and I really applaud that effort. So we too are keystone species. We have a choice here. Are we going to do it in a way that is destructive, or are we going to do it in a way that's really supportive and helps regenerate our landscapes and our riverscapes in particular? So I certainly, and Brock and I are really trying to support folks in doing the latter. And it takes a whole world to do it. And we have lots of tools that we can help share with you as to you all. And we recognize that this is a team effort, and we hope that you will join us in this effort, because it's going to take all of us. And thank you so much for tuning in and listening. And I think at this point, we're going to turn it over to a Q&A moment. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Kate and Brock. That was fantastic. I never get tired of hearing about beavers, I have to say. And we do have some questions for you. And so we're really glad that you're staying on for a few of these. Let's see. I don't see where they are. What happened to them?
I saw one I can answer.
Okay, would you go ahead then, Brock?
you're
Thank
looking.
you.
Yeah, James Hansen was asking about if there's any areas open to the public to see beavers in Mendocino County, which is a great question. Because Outlet Creek, that you know, the folks with Mendocino RCD and Marcella can talk about, is one of the great beaver habitats you all have, but I don't think it's so open to the public. There are beavers in Big River, and so if you were to get a kayak or a stand-up paddleboard or a canoe and go up Big River, you might get to see some beaver habitat up there. But otherwise, in Mendocino proper, you know, there's some beaver action around coming out of Lake Pillsbury, main stem eel. People talk about good chewed areas and things again, though, but there's nothing like Martinez or Napa Creek in downtown Napa where you can just show up and watch. But looks like Kate Marienchild's got a hand up. You know where some beavers are we can see that are public?
She needs to be unmuted. Let's see, ask to unmute, okay?
Yeah, I can unmute her if
Okay,
you want.
unmute, yes, please do.
Give me a moment. Yeah, if anybody else has questions, please raise your hand or just post it in the chat.
While we're waiting for you to unmute, Kate, there was just also questions about, are there any beaver main stem Russian or tribs? And yes, they are in the main stem south of Healdsburg. They really love those gravel ponds. They've been sighted in Dry Creek, and then also main stem Russian at the confluence of Dry Creek and all around where those gravel ponds are. And I have paddleboarded and kayaked, and I haven't seen the beaver themselves, but I've certainly seen their chews and signs of them. All right, looks like Kate has been successfully unmuted. Kate, what's your question?
Well, I'm wondering if you have on your map a beaver dam, beaver area that's on Outlet Creek along 162, Highway 162 that goes up to Coho. And it's a place where if you're enterprising, you can get a boat or some flotation device in the water and go downstream just a few hundred yards and see a beaver dam. But or you could swim it if you wanted to. I've done it. I've been down there. So
Nice.
So our offer to you all, if this, to the degree this is Mendocino County focused, is because I see in there that all of a sudden Griff's like, oh, there's beavers in Hearst, and then Linda's talking about beavers in Black Oak Ranch, and Kate, get out there with your iNaturalist, document these things. You're it, people. Like, you all know better than us, so let us know.
Yes, that is a really good way. And iNaturalist is a really good way to document those things. I don't see any other questions.
I
here.
saw another one here that said, When in my limited experience with beavers, it appeared they were largely nocturnal. Is that actually the case? And if so, what would be the best times to see or encounter beaver when you know they're around? Great question. And yeah, beaver tend to be more nocturnal. Some have a theory that that's because they've gotten more pressure from hunting by humans. However, regardless, yes, that has also been my experience, that they tend to be more nocturnal. However, they're crepuscular, so they do come out at sunset and sunrise. And if you have a spot where you can hide out and watch them, that's the time to come see them. I definitely have seen them in the daytime, but they do tend to be more shy. And one of the places that I see them almost without fail is Taylor Creek, where Brock showed the slide of the wetland. Again, this is the creek that connects Fallen Leaf Lake with South Lake Tahoe. And Fallen Leaf Lake has a campground there. And if anyone's ever up in that area, I realize it's a hump, but go out to the Fallen Leaf Lake Dam and you can literally just stand on the dam, and there's a beaver lodge about 50 feet away on the bank, and they come out and feed. And pretty much every time I go, I see them at sunset and sunrise. And there's great birding too. There's, you know, kingfishers hunting. There's all kinds of, yeah, fantastic birds. But like Brock said, I would also consider going out for a little sunset stroll in Napa if you can, because those ones are urban, and there's literally a pedestrian bridge that goes over Napa Creek. And then there's a road, a vehicle bridge, the Pearl Street Bridge right there. And those ones are really easy to view as well. Brock, do you want to add anything to that?
No, but now all of a sudden everybody's like up at Alpine Meadows, and next Alpine Meadows is Squaw Creek in Squaw Valley, adjacent there. And there's,
Yeah.
if you're a golfer, you want to just go out and cruise around in the Squaw Creek through the golf course. There's an incredible beaver habitat. So yeah, you could just put in your like best of beaver in California. But seriously, put this stuff on iNaturalist, because it's lit. Like Kate said, the director of the department asked us where the beaver are. We were kind of like, I think that's your job, but okay. So this is truly the opportunity to use citizen science and crowdsourcing of everyone who's out there with your phone and this amazing software called iNaturalist to actually, you know, contribute to the work in the state, because we don't know.
Yeah, that's great, Brock. I see a question from Linda McElwee saying, will DFW permit the fencing to address flooding strategies in salmon-bearing streams?
Great question. Hi, Linda. Glad to have you on. This is so exciting. So in place, so the dam is already there, and that likely is considered a part of the stream if it's already there. Putting in a flow, a pond leveler device is actually just notching the dam and putting a pipe through. So it's not changing the characteristics of the stream bed per se. And I know in some cases there has been the need to get a stream bed alteration permit from the department to put in these devices. For example, the one that we put in with Caltrans. And in that case, they were able to do it as an emergency 1600 permit. But otherwise, I think it's really going to depend on what region you're in. You are in Region 1, and they certainly have experience with beaver dams. And thankfully, there's less of an argument in Region 1 about whether beaver are native or not. But I know any kind of dam, like in some places in Region 1, we have heard that even trying to like do anything to the dam requires a 1600 permit. So the answer is it depends, and we'd be happy to talk with you more offline. There are in some places some examples up in the Pacific Northwest where they have made these devices that actually include a fish passage component. They were targeting, was it Chinook, Brock, or was it
They were working on Coho,
Oh,
actually.
it was Coho, you're right.
On
Yeah.
Western Washington, yeah.
Yeah, so that one's called the Snohomish Pond Leveler, and it's got a box and this whole thing. And so the technology exists. However, to us, you know, the dams, they are holding water back, and fish are generally only needing passage when there's high flow anyway. And so again, it really depends on the conditions and what system you're working with. Brock, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think there's just literally been so many studies looking at beaver dams and passage. And like Kate said, at high flow events, you've got water coming over top of the whole dam. And the way the dams have so much diversity to them that the adults, and there's a pool typically at the base, so the adult passage issue or juvenile out migration. And there may be some issues with drought systems, with juvie out migration, where you've got a seasonal beaver dam that's blocking it up. And the funny thing is, then people are like, well, that dam's got to go. And then you're like, well, if the dam goes, then the creek is dry and it's down to cobbles. And I think fish need water more than they need that fast. So there's this kind of thing about babies and bathwater saying, you know, and which one do you want to throw out? And it's a really interesting conundrum when we've got watersheds and creek channels that are so degraded, so incised, so downcut, so flashy, so lacking of in-stream flow, going dry to intermittent pools, that we sometimes find ourselves, when folks start wanting to blame the beaver for a situation, we're like, maybe we should, you know, have a bigger conversation here. So it's an opportunity for participating in such conversations, and I'm glad you guys are on the case at Peregrine Audubon. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I live on Bechtel Creek. This is Maricela, and I live on Bechtel Creek, and I've been here 41 years watching the creek, you know, and change so much, and drying is what it has done more than anything. It has gotten to the place where it's only pools, and the pools are what save any fish at all. You know, without the pools, there would be no fish. They would all die. I mean, it's a coho bearing stream. So if there were beaver dams that were holding back pools of water, I think that would be a really good thing, because they would be deeper and cooler and more protected than our occasional pool that we have here. That's my opinion anyways.
You know, OAC, we co-founded this entity called the Russian River Coho Water Resources Partnership. And people might be interested in looking at that. Look on the website, Coho Partnership. And it's a group of both resource conservation districts, Sonoma and Gold Ridge. We've got the UCC grant folks, with OAC, Trout Unlimited. We're looking at 5 sub-watersheds in the Russian River. And this was all about water quantity and thus water rights, which was kind of a conversation you weren't allowed to have apparently 10 years ago, even though fish need water. And what has really been determined in the Russian, which sounds a lot to me like your Bechtel Creek story, is the upland land use of the deforestation leading to desertification and degradation, because we've increased the runoff and the sediment and the lack of recharge and the increase of runoff, which has incised these streams, and then you dewatered them. And there's some really good data showing that what is called the days of disconnection. How many days are the consistent stream flow disconnected into pools, and the die-off curve for coho salmon because of loss of flow and dissolved oxygen and increased predation with either birds or raccoons on these salmonids is huge. And it's the limiting factor on the rearing habitat for the juvenile coho and steelhead, and in big rivers, it's Chinook in some cases. And our sense is yeah, we want to have beaver's a part of the solution. It's not the problem. There may be some very isolated situations, and we think we have enough tools in the toolbox to mitigate those. And the beaver glass is half full. It's not half empty. And we should, and dry streams, to me, incised dry streams are a much bigger issue in the long arc. And we're sticking with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing the questions that go right to you, Brock, or right to you, Kate, and that's why I'm not picking up all the questions, but I think you've answered them. Do you see any more on your lists?
I don't have any more. No.
All right. Well, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm really thank you for all the resources that you provide. Also, oh, Kate has her hand up. You can just ask the question, Kate. Is she? Oh, she's muted. Ryan? Is Ryan on? Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Okay.
Well, one last question I had was that the word Ukiah was in
Yes.
those native names for beavers in this area.
I saw that too, Kate.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
We have mused over that same thing, and if there were any native speakers who could unpack that etymology, if there's something to do with, I mean, you could imagine Ukiah Valley back in the day when that river system talked to its floodplain must have been a really juicy, wet beaver, just biodiversity haven, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we would love it when you figure it out, Kate. You let us know.
And was this talk recorded?
Yes. It's being recorded.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Really.
Such exciting work, and I'm so impressed at how much work you've done.
It's enormous.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brock and I joke, next time we're gonna do a sloth campaign, because when you work with beaver, it's like, woo, you're working round the clock, no stopping. But thankfully you get to work with the whole family, and it's like a group, and everyone's super fun to hang out with. So we're into it.
Uh-huh.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And so such good work. Yeah. I'm excited.
Dang.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Good night.
All right.
Have a great sleep. And
Yeah. Thanks everyone, and feel free to reach out if you have questions, and look forward to seeing all your observations on iNaturalist.
Yes.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you. And
All right.
I think Ryan has to turn us off because he's the tech guy. Hey,